Welcome to the supernatural tale of a stranger's grace. Written by Harmony Taylor, presented by Dawnspire Digital. Each week we uncover mysteries where we'll meet God. May you enjoy this week's episode.
Chapter 7. Eleanor stood by her window, the city below bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The evening pressed down on her chest, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Mrs. Goldblum's confusion, the bruise on her wrist, the lost look in her eyes, it gnawed at Eleanor's heart. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much larger, something darker. She felt it in her bones. Her thoughts drifted to Claire. It had been weeks since they last spoke, and their last conversation had been strained. Claire was always busy, her life filled with work, friends, and obligations that seemed to leave little room for her mother. But maybe tonight Claire could help. Maybe she would know what to do about Mrs. Goldblum. Eleanor's fingers hovered over her phone. What if Claire didn't answer? Or worse, what if she did, and Eleanor was met with that familiar tone of impatience? The one that made her feel like she was intruding, like she was a burden. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. This wasn't about her. Mrs. Goldblum needed help. Claire was the only person she could think to turn to. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. The ringing seemed to stretch on forever, each tone amplifying the anxiety twisting in her gut. Finally, the call connected. "Mom?" Claire's voice came through, clipped and hurried. "Do you need something?" The words hit like a cold splash of water. Eleanor's heart sank, but she pressed on, determined to push past the discomfort. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, forcing a smile into her voice. "I didn't mean to bother you, but I need some advice." There was a pause, and Eleanor could almost hear Claire weighing her response. "I'm kind of in the middle of something right now, Mom. Can it wait?" Eleanor's stomach twisted. "It's about Mrs. Goldblum," she said quickly, hoping the urgency in her voice would hold Claire's attention. "She's been forgetting things, misplacing her keys, leaving the stove on. I'm really worried about her, Claire. I don't know what to do." "A neighbor?" Claire's voice softened, but only slightly. "Yes." Another pause. Eleanor could picture Claire on the other end, her brow furrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer but still distant. "Mom? I'm sure it's nothing," Claire said, her words rushed. "She's getting older. People forget things. It happens." "I know," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling, but she was so scared, she didn't even remember leaving her keys on the counter. I don't know how to help her." Claire sighed, and Eleanor could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. "Look, Mom, I get it, but I really don't have time for this right now. Can't you talk to someone at the Mangrove? Or maybe a social worker?" Eleanor's heart sank further. She had hoped for more, for some kind of reassurance, but instead she felt like she was intruding on Claire's carefully constructed life. "Yeah," she said quietly. "You're probably right." "Okay, I've really got to go," Claire said, her tone brisk again. "But let me know how it goes, all right? We'll talk soon." "Sure," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Take care, Claire." "You too, Mom. Bye." The line went dead before she could say, "I love you." Eleanor stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear. The silence in her apartment felt suffocating. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand trembling as she placed it back on the table. She sucked in a breath, trying to keep the tears at bay. She had known, deep down, that this was how the conversation would go. Claire was always busy, always rushing from one thing to the next. Eleanor had tried to understand, to be patient, but moments like this made it hard. Moments like this made her feel like she was standing on the outside, looking in at a life she no longer had access to. With a sigh, Eleanor turned back to the window. Jez was sitting on the bench, his head bowed as if in prayer, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. Maybe, Eleanor thought, it was time to stop looking for answers in the wrong places. Maybe it was time to trust in something bigger than herself. She should have prayed earlier. God had been there, waiting for her to ask him for help. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor moved to the couch, her eyes searching. She picked up her Bible from the small table by the door, the leather cover soft beneath her fingers. She didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was okay. Maybe for now it was enough to simply have faith. As she sat down, the Bible resting on her lap, Eleanor closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. For Mrs. Goldblum, for Claire, for herself, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of peace. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes of gold across Eleanor's ceiling. But despite the warmth of the sun, an icy grip of anxiety clung to her chest. Sleep had been elusive, her dreams haunted by images of Mrs. Goldblum, disoriented, lost, bruised. She rose from bed, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The familiar rituals of her morning, grinding coffee beans, the comforting aroma filling the kitchen, did little to ease the knot in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something, that Mrs. Goldblum's situation was more serious than she had realized. Eleanor decided to bake another batch of cookies, a simple act of kindness that would give her an excuse to check on Mrs. Goldblum. As she measured out flour and sugar, her hands moved mechanically, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. The bruise on Mrs. Goldblum's wrist, the confusion in her eyes, it all pointed to something more than just forgetfulness. "Pray," she muttered to herself, mixing the dough with more force than necessary. "I need to pray." Once the cookies were in the oven, she knelt on the rug, her heart heavy. "God," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. You know what's going on, Lord, and I need you to help me." As Eleanor knelt in prayer, her heart heavy with the weight of guilt, she felt a stirring deep within her. The words she tried to speak faltered, but it wasn't a lack of faith. It was as if something greater than herself was rising up, pushing past the pain and demanding to be released. A warmth spread through her chest, gentle at first, like the soft glow of sunlight breaking through dark clouds. But it quickly intensified, flooding her entire body with a power she had never known. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with something more. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat, as the presence of God filled the room, thick and undeniable. The smell of roses filled the space. She opened her mouth to pray, but the words didn't come. Instead, a deep peace washed over her, silencing the noise of her thoughts. The tears that had once burned with sorrow now flowed freely, carrying with them a joy she couldn't explain. She realized what this was, who it was. "Holy Spirit," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you are so good to me." And then, like a rushing wind, the Holy Spirit descended upon her, filling every part of her being. It was as if her very soul had been touched by divine fire, consuming the doubt, the fear, and the shame that had kept her bound for so long. The weight she had carried for years melted away, replaced by a sense of overwhelming love and acceptance. Her lips began to move again, but this time the words were not her own. They poured out of her in a language she had never spoken, but one that felt ancient and sacred, as though her spirit had found its true voice for the first time. She let the words flow. Strange syllables tumbled from her lips, unfamiliar but powerful. Eleanor's spirit stirred, and she shut her eyes, praying more fervently in the strange language. She didn't understand the words, but she knew, deep in her soul, that God was guiding her tongue, using the best words for this moment. "God, you are amazing, and I praise you. Our name," she whispered between the strange syllables. "Thank you." Her spirit eased, and Eleanor sat up straight, staring at the rug with wonder. "I praise your name above all names," she breathed, clutching her shirt as a grin spread across her face. God was up to something special. The alarm for the cookies sounded. With the cookies still warm, Eleanor placed them in a basket and made her way down the hallway, humming Amazing Grace. Her heart pounded with a mixture of apprehension and determination. She paused outside Mrs. Goldblum's door, her hand hovering over the brass knocker. She knocked gently. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Dread settled in her chest. "What should I do, Lord?" she whispered, gripping the basket tighter. She tried the doorknob, and to her surprise it turned easily. The door swung open, revealing the dimly lit interior of Mrs. Goldblum's apartment. "Mrs. Goldblum?" Eleanor called out, her voice hesitant. The apartment was eerily quiet. Eleanor stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the familiar space. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in shadow. The air was thick, stale, and carried a faint metallic scent that made Eleanor's stomach turn. She walked through the apartment, her heart racing. In the kitchen, she found a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter, the milk curdled. A glass of red juice had been spilled on the floor, its contents drying into a sticky residue. The signs of neglect were unsettling, a stark contrast to Mrs. Goldblum's usual meticulousness. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She checked the bedroom, the bed unmade, the sheets rumpled. The bathroom was in disarray, towels crumpled on the floor. But there was no sign of Mrs. Goldblum. Panic surged in Eleanor's chest. She needed to find her. She needed to make sure she was okay. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed Mrs. Goldblum's coat and left the apartment, her mind racing with worry. She opened her mouth, praying in that same strange language, her words tumbling out in a desperate plea for guidance. She needed to clear her head, to figure out what to do next. The park seemed like the only place to go. As she walked, ignoring the pain in her hip, her cane forgotten, her thoughts spiraled. What if something terrible had happened to Mrs. Goldblum? What if she had fallen, or worse? And then she saw him, Jez. He was sitting on a bench near the pond, his back to her, his head bowed in quiet contemplation. Something about his presence calmed her, like a still point in the chaos of her thoughts. Without hesitation, Eleanor limped toward him. "Jez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his eyes warm and full of understanding. "Ellie," he said gently, standing to greet her. "You should have taken care to walk slower." "I couldn't," she admitted, her hands trembling. "I'm worried about Mrs. Goldblum. She's not in her apartment." Jez nodded, as if he already knew. "You need to call for help." Eleanor blinked, the obvious solution hitting her like a wave. "Of course. How could I have forgotten?" "Oh, no. You don't have dementia, Ellie," Jez said, placing a firm hand on her arm. "You were worried. The stress made you forget an important step." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "But what if something terrible has happened to her?" Jez smiled, a calm, reassuring smile that seemed to chase away the shadows in Eleanor's mind. "Even in the darkest times, God is with us. He won't abandon us." Eleanor nodded, her heart still racing but steadied by Jez's presence. "I'll go back to the mangrove, alert the staff." "And when you see her," Jez added softly, "pray for her mind. God has not forgotten her." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. But Jez's words gave her strength. She stood, her heart still pounding, but her steps more certain now. She would go back to the mangrove and alert the staff, and she would pray.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can read the entire book available on Amazon. Get more content by visiting dawnspiredigital.com. I'll see you next time. May God's peace be with you.